Good morning. Thank you everyone for attending our inaugural PDT Summit, which is taking place in a virtual format this year. My name is Kane Akai. I'm one of the senior healthcare research analysts at Chardan, where our vision is to help identify companies with high potential for investment returns based on creating real value for society through disruptive innovation. Our compliance department has asked us to read this message, and this is effective for the rest of the day. Our participants have attested and agreed that they will not share or discuss any material, non-public, or confidential information that they are aware of. The recording of the segments of this conference will be made available to clients after the event. I want to welcome everyone to this session, Navigating the Last Mile of Establishing PDT Reimbursement. Joining me on the panel are Laurel Sweeney, Principal, Access Strategies, Dr. Paul Jeffrey, Principal, Jeffrey Consulting, and Annie Molnar, CEO, Digital Therapeutic Alliance. As a reminder to attendees, if you would like to ask a question of our speakers, please type it into the question box under the video player. Let's get started. PDTs do represent relatively new and novel therapeutic approaches requiring education of three primary stakeholders, prescribers, patients, and payers, about the distinct features, therapeutic benefits, cost savings, and other advantages of PDTs compared to alternative therapies. Hence, we have emphasized to investors that FDA authorization is a necessary but not sufficient step towards having a commercially successful PDT. Unlike newly approved drugs, which get broad and immediate coverage from Medicare and payers under a pharmacy benefit, PDTs as Class 2 software as a medical device are currently having to seek out and establish their own reimbursement. Regardless of the degree of benefit provided, physicians will be reluctant to prescribe PDTs if they can't get reimbursed for doing so in a manner that integrates seamlessly with their existing office workflow. Likewise, patients will be reluctant to purchase PDTs if they have to pay for them out of pocket. Our panelists are all involved in helping companies with their access to market strategies, advising on how to navigate the path towards obtaining broad reimbursement coverage for their PDTs. To start, let me ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us about their backgrounds. Paul, why don't you go first, then Andy, then Laurel.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Jeffrey. I am recently retired as Senior Director of Pharmacy for MassHealth, which is the Massachusetts Medicaid program. I'm also Associate Professor of Family Medicine and Community Health at the UMass Chan Medical School. And I'm currently president, I'm immediate past president as of last Friday of the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. And I also have experience with having adopted a digital therapeutic on the MassHealth formulary, probably the reason I'm here. I speak neither for UMass Medical School, nor MassHealth, nor AMCP directly. So I'm on behalf of myself in this capacity. So thank you for having me here.
Hi, everybody. Andy Molnar, CEO of the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. Again, thank you for having me here as well. I spent about 12 years in pharmaceutical companies. Then I moved over to Pear Therapeutics. I spent a year there working on their market access and government affairs team. So specifically focusing on creating benefit categories and looking to get reimbursement for products like PDTs. Then I went over to Cognoa and worked on their commercial team, started putting together all the pieces for how they would go to market and get market access. I realized I cared more about the plumbing of how all these products would come to market than just simply one company. So when this position opened up as the head of the trade organization to work towards how to commercialize these products and get paid for, I jumped at it. So it's almost a year now, which is crazy that I've been at the DTA. So thank you all.
Laurel.
Great. Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for having me here today. I spent a good part of my career in the medical device world, working for HP, Agilent, and then Philips. A good deal of that time was spent in government relations. So I spent a lot of time on the Hill negotiating, for example, the telehealth benefit. So when we talk about a digital therapeutics benefit, I get flashbacks to those negotiations we had over cost and the reason we ended up with a very sort of restricted telehealth benefit. I ran the market access group at Philips, where we, as you know, focused on a variety of different products and services, but telehealth being one of them, and also digital access. So when I left Philips in 2018, I started my own firm, where I work now with a lot of actually small to medium-sized startups in the area of devices, AI, a lot of digital therapeutic and digital health, because I really feel like that's an area that's growing and also can really make a difference in medicine. And so it's important for me to work with that. I also sit on the Digital Medical Payment Advisory Group, which is a group of the AMA that looks at coding gaps and things and coverage gaps for digital solutions, including digital therapeutics. And I guess I'll throw my qualifier in there that I do not speak for the DMPAG here, but it's been a good experience. And then I also, I am a trustee at a hospital where I chair the finance committee, which gives me a sort of different perspective from the provider in terms of cost and investment in telehealth. So again, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Thanks.
Well, we really appreciate all of you joining us today. Laurel, to start, in order to level set this discussion for listeners who are new to reimbursement issues, can I ask you to define some terms we will be referring to? And starting with coding, what are and who uses HCPCS codes, and within that, CPT codes?
Okay, I think I'd like to just start by level set what we mean when we talk about reimbursement, because reimbursement is about coverage, coding, and payment. And the code piece tells a payer how to pay. It doesn't necessarily say whether they will pay. And that's really important, because I hear a lot of people talk about coding without context of coverage. And then also on the payment side, certainly how they price the codes impacts digital therapeutics quite directly. So to answer your question, Kay, a HCPCS code is composed of the current procedural terminology, or CPT. Those are HCPCS level 1 codes. That's a numeric coding system maintained by the American Medical Association. And the CPT codes describe and identify medical services and procedures furnished by physicians and other healthcare providers. So an example of, so there's always a physician involved in that. And that's important to think about with digital therapeutics, because an example of a CPT code under HCPCS 1 would be the remote therapeutic monitoring codes, or the remote patient monitoring codes, which some digital therapeutic companies have used successfully, and that is part of the CPT. The level 2 or HCPCS level 2 codes, they're used primarily to identify things like products, supplies, and services that aren't included in the CPT. Things like ambulance services, medical supplies, and durable medical equipment when they're used outside of the physician office. So I think Andy's going to talk in a little while about a HCPCS level 2 code that was recently approved by CMS for payer. These codes are alphabetically categorized. And so a DME, for example, are E codes, and the payer code is an A code, which is a medical supply. So it's a different way to look at how to code something outside of the physician office.
Okay, and Laura, as you said, the code only says how to pay, not what and whether the payer will pay. So with respect to coverage, can you describe the differences between pharmacy versus medical benefit?
Well, that would probably take a whole seminar, but I will say that under a medical benefit, the payer's criteria is what they call medical necessity, or in Medicare's world, it would be called reasonable and necessary for the Medicare patient. Also, to know that Medicare is a defined benefit program, and so to cover something needs to fit into a defined benefit category. That's one of the issues with digital therapeutics, is that there is no defined benefit category at this point. DME would be a benefit category, physician services would be another one. And so they're looking in terms of evidence that is a little bit different than what the FDA 510K process, for example, would look for. They're looking for safety and efficacy. You know, is the device safe? Is it going to do what your claims say it's going to be doing? Claims can be pretty generic and not real. The payer is looking for evidence of clinical outcomes. improvement over what's existing in coverage. They're also looking many times for the health economic benefits to that. So for example, are you reducing hospitalizations or reducing ER visits and those kinds of things? That's all part of sort of a medical coverage determination. It's a separate process from the FDA. The FDA has introduced what they call the early payer feedback program, which allows payers to come to your pre-submission meeting and provide some input into the kinds of evidence that they would be looking for. But again, it's a separate process. On the drug side, it's a little bit different in that once you have a drug approved, the evidence requirements are different. It's a different part of the FDA that's looking at that and approving that. And once you're on the market, then it's getting on the drug formularies. And so it's not the same coverage criteria. And it's also a lot of price negotiation. So sort of an overview, it's like two very different processes and two different ways of looking at demonstrating value to the payer. So.
Okay. So with that great foundation, Andy, let's expand on coding for PDTs.
Yep.
Two important recent advancements have been achieved with the establishment of new Category 1 codes for remote therapy monitoring and a specific code for cognitive behavioral therapy monitoring that become effective in 2022 and 23, and the new Level 2 HCPC code to describe prescription digital behavioral therapy. Can you tell us how each of these will benefit prescribers of PDTs?
Sure. So now the usage of those codes, we're trying to do a study on that, and hopefully we can get back to the team, because we really don't know at this point how many people are using those codes. But if you start with remote physiological monitoring, or the RPM codes that came out, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago now. Do you remember, Laurel?
Yeah, it was about 3 years, 3 or 4 years, but almost 4. Remember, we lost 2 years during a pandemic. So.
Yeah. You're right. So it's probably more like 4. For all the other companies, like Pear, for example, I mean, because of cognitive behavioral therapy, there's no physiological component for that, which means if providers were using these products, they didn't have any way of getting reimbursed for doing so. And so as Laura was explaining with CPT codes, every single thing that a doctor does falls under a CPT code, right? And so if now you have something that not only falls out of their workflow as a new technology, and they're not getting paid to use it, it starts to become really difficult to have that conversation about how the innovation should be adopted. Now, of course, we see early adopters using it anyway, just because of the benefit that prescription digital therapeutics can have. But now we finally have a way for providers to get paid for certain activities that they do, particularly if they're looking at what the patient is doing outside of the office. Now, the other thing is, this is just the beginning, right? The one code that's specifically for cognitive behavioral therapy is a supply code. Otherwise, the codes are right now, it's for cognitive behavioral therapy, respiratory, and musculoskeletal. And when you start to think, okay, we're going to have one code that covers every single type of remote therapeutic monitoring, and you start looking at things like depression and comparing that to like cancer or diabetes, and having the same reimbursement amount for each one of those. And I'm not going to say which one should cost more or less, but I think over time we're going to have to start seeing more granularity to these codes. But that being said, it is a great baseline. We're super excited that the providers can get paid. Now, the level 2 HCPC code, which I know it's very well known that Pear was the organization that put in for it. That was for behavioral therapy, which really covers almost like 70% of the products that are on the market. So it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes. And the importance of that HCPC code is that I don't think providers are yet ready for some of the remote therapeutic monitoring codes that are out there, such as onboarding a patient, right? I think that will come over time, but it's the way that a lot of these companies function is that you prescribe the product And then something like a specialty pharmacy or a patient services center works with the patient to get them onboarded onto the product, and they work on billing the payer through that behavioral health HCPCS code that is now out. Sorry, it's like HCPCS versus HCPCS. Like everyone says it differently, and I keep like switching back and forth. So with that, a lot of the companies are trying to sort of take things out of the hands of the provider because it's kind of burdensome to put all of that on the office staff to download products. And so with that, we're starting to see that CMS is in a place where they see the need for this type of coding for these products and for the patients. Again, it's a baseline. It's really kind of, it can't be long-term that every single product uses the exact same HCPCS code, which ultimately will get valued at a certain price, and not every product is worth the same amount. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Within, and we're going to talk about this later, and I'm sorry I'm going on and on here, within the access to prescription digital therapeutics bill that was just introduced, it actually asks for individual product coding for HCPCS codes. So we'll have to see where that goes. That's obviously something that the industry wants, but it's not always how HCPCS codes work. With drugs, for example, it's by molecule, but that's
Right.
almost for each drug, you know. So still a lot to think about there and to figure out as we move this forward.
So just expanding on that last point, you know, you mentioned the newly introduced legislation, the Access to Prescription Digital Therapeutic Act of 2022, and you mentioned describing by molecule. So can you tell us about the benefit of having a defined category for PDTs?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in the 1960s, when Medicare was created, I don't think they had the foresight that apps would be treating disease. Or how could you, right? And so it took until I think 2005 for there to even be a pharmacy benefit within Medicare. So it took 2 presidencies just to ensure that seniors had access to pharmaceutical drugs, which almost seems insane. So with that, software as a medical device now falls outside of these two different categories. Some would argue that it doesn't. Some would argue that it fits under DME or existing benefit categories, but we haven't been able to get that accepted by CMS. Yeah, I see you shaking your head, Laurel. I go back and forth with so many different people on that same topic. So with the legislation, it would create the benefit category within Medicare, which is no simple task. It would create the proper HCPCS code mechanism for these products to bill. And then it basically then gives CMS the opportunity, as they do with every other product, to say this is clinically valuable, or this is clinically significant for us to offer it or not. And when we look at that the HCPCS code that just came out, CMS is not paying for it. They literally created that and said, commercial payers, this will make it easier for you to contract with commercial payers. And so there's so much that needs to be done. The legislation would set us up for a really nice future in the next few years. Of course, that's if it passes. I think there's something like 5,000 bills on the that have been introduced this year. So we're really looking for how to move that forward.
Well, that said, I mean, the confirmation of the codes that we know are going into effect this year and next, you know, how significant, how monumental, you know, within the big scheme of things is the establishment of these towards eventually getting broader coverage and payment set up the way that can lead to successful commercialization of PDTs.
Can I add? Yeah,
Oh,
go
sure.
ahead. No, I just wanted to say, you know, just a couple clarifying things. The current remote therapeutic monitoring codes, the device supply code is for musculoskeletal and respiratory only. And the CPT did approve a CPT-1 code for cognitive behavioral therapy, but that won't go into effect until next year.
Right.
Just want to make sure people understand that. And also it has to go through a rulemaking process. So the proposed physician fee schedule will determine whether Medicare will cover that or not. Just because, again, you have a code doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be covered. So I just wanted to like sort of clarify that for people to know that that's not in play right now. And also on the HCPCS 2 code, that's a miscellaneous supply code, which means that miscellaneous codes are payer and patient dependent in terms of payment. So it's not, the goal here is really routine optimal payment. That's what we really want for digital therapeutics. Both of these provide some sort of workarounds for some of the gaps right now. But what it doesn't do is guarantee routine optimal payment. And I think that's what we're trying to do with the legislation and other things. But I just wanted to clarify that for people that are listening.
Yes, that's helpful. Andy, anything else to add?
Nope, that was said perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, so great. So let's move on to Paul and talk about the process that a payer utilizes to come up with a coverage decision. And Paul, can you discuss what process the state Medicaid plan goes through when deciding to cover a new and innovative technology like PDTs? I know you have the experience with MassHealth.
Thank you, Kay. And I think it's also, let me just comment on the last conversation about the codes. The codes are a form of language, and it's necessary that we're able to communicate. So from a payer perspective, it helps us define what it is that we're paying for so that we can then, if it is a local determination of the coverage, then what it is we want to pay for. So it's an evolutionary step, and I think it's a critical step because everything we do, of course, is based on electronic billing and so forth and payment. So it's necessary to have that standard established so we know what we're discussing. Depending on the resources of the organization, I think will reflect a little bit about how these products are evaluated. Speaking for myself, but my experience at MassHealth, we had established a pipeline monitoring process for products coming to market that was critical in terms of our budget impact forecasting. Of course, we established that for drugs specifically, but we used it as well for other products coming to market. So a well-resourced organization will be able to project and foresee what's coming down the pike so that they can establish what their evaluation methodology will be and whether or not this particular thing, if you will, fits into something they want to pay. Is the evidence sufficient for payment to be made? And then how to manage it. This back and forth about which category of benefit does it belong in becomes a determination as part of the evaluation process. So in my experience at MassHealth, we had we had a product evaluation committee internally. And if it was a drug therapy, whether it be a pharmacy benefit drug or a medical benefit drug, we did the evaluation, doing a critical evidence-based a review to determine if the evidentiary standard met our standard for coverage. There have been a few issues with the FDA on drug therapy that raised a few eyebrows. To the point that was made earlier, establishing the code and even getting FDA approval does not mean that a payer is going to cover the particular product. We would then, for example, and this would be commonplace for a member of the evaluation team to do the legwork, the grunt work, if you will, evaluate the literature, prepare a monograph or a report of whatever stripe is appropriate for that organization, and then present that information to a decision-making committee. So we follow the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee model, if you will, but with internal staff. We then make a determination of whether the evidence supports the claims and make a determination if the state wanted to cover that under the pharmacy benefit. So, or under the medical benefit, we would make that determination. Most durable medical equipment went down a different channel of evaluation and was different from the pharmacy benefit determination structure. However, we discovered, obviously, over time, we were evaluating any number of medical supplies that were moving through the pharmacy benefit, classically diabetes test strips. And then more recently, another type of digital therapeutics item, and that would be continuous glucose monitoring. So in the pharmacy benefit under the Massachusetts Medicaid program, we even had a page on our formulary for non-drug items that were covered under the pharmacy benefit. And in there, you would find diabetes test strips, and that's where you would find Pear Therapeutics products, Reset and Reset O. But the evaluation process is rigorous. And it's usually not a one and done. Now, with certain drugs, we have long-standing practices about how we would evaluate those. And the internal review committee could essentially make a determination on the first pass if the drug looked like other drugs that we had previously been evaluating. If it's a novel therapy like cell and gene therapy, then we'll engage other parts of our organization and make sure that we have a full review of our medical team that also does evaluations of certain services that will be covered by the Medicaid program, so that we can make sure that we're all speaking from the same page. And lastly, in the sense of digital therapeutics and other durable medical equipment and or medical supplies, we bring in that unit of our organization to help with the evaluation. So the evaluation will be pharmacy based. If it's a medical supply drug, we reach out to our medical team and bring them into the discussion. If it looks like a durable medical equipment or a medical supply, we bring that group in, which includes, all of these groups include physician advisors or physicians alone, and then make a determination. We also typically would do outreach, and that could come at multiple different points along the evaluation process. Even in our pipeline monitoring, we might reach out to providers or other experts to help us understand where this particular product belongs and what, let's say, what the local standard of care is or is likely to be around this product. So again, using a drug example, when Aduhelm came to market, we created a little expert committee that included geriatricians and other neurologists from around the city to help us formulate the decision, a kitchen cabinet, if you will. Once that determination is made, then we will launch it into our system, depending again on whether it's a pharmacy benefit, a medical benefit, or however we determine the particular product should be covered. So it's a technology assessment committee. This one's focused on pharmaceuticals and related products, primarily that go through the pharmacy benefit, but not exclusively. And having the codes are critical. We cannot, for example, we can't pay for a drug unless it has a national drug code established. Of course, every drug that comes to market has such a thing. And there's just one. It's the NDC code, period. It's not a matter of level 1 or level 2. It's got an A, J, Q code. What is this thing? And we have to go through the interpretation of understanding that. And that becomes material if we talk about it, and maybe in a question coming up about how did we decide to handle the product? What made that work for us to put it into the prescription drug benefit? So that's how we evaluate some of these decisions. So Prescription Digital Therapeutics was a novel category of benefit, if you will, and I consider it that. I think it needs its own place personally, because it otherwise gets lost in an ever-expanding sea of therapeutic options. We can talk about digital therapeutics, but now we have all other kinds of drug therapies coming to market. I mentioned cell and gene therapy, and we get tissue regenerative therapy, radiopharmaceuticals. You can go on and on about, it depends on whether you're a lumper or a splitter. There's plenty of splitting to be done. From an organizational management perspective, the more things can be managed through a common workflow, the more likely they are to be adopted, be efficient, cost effective, and so forth. So it helps for us to have the coding. for sure.
So Paul, specific to Reset and Reset-O, were there key value characteristics that the products and the data they had in terms of real world evidence or health economics and outcome research that enabled the positive coverage decision by MassHealth?
So that's a great question. I don't know, Andy, if you wanted to jump in on the previous comment before I get going on this one.
If you don't mind, can I?
Oh, sure, go right ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to sort of enforce how important this topic is. So Dr. Andrea Ostrovsky, who used to run Medicaid under the Obama administration, and Everett Crossland, Chief Commercial Officer at Cognito, did a study on breakthrough devices, and it's up on the DTA's website if you guys want to look at it, or maybe I can put it in the chat. But when they looked at it by disease state for breakthrough products that are now covered, 95% of the FDA approved or cleared breakthrough products that are somatic or physical health specialties for adults are reimbursed by Medicare. 0 of the FDA approved or cleared breakthrough devices focused on behavioral health or neurology are reimbursed by Medicare. And that's all because the coding is not there. And so you have these products where the FDA is saying, this is a breakthrough product, and then CMS is saying, we just don't have any way to pay for it. And then so everything we're talking about here is coming out in that data. I will put the whole article in there so I don't read it just verbatim for everybody.
Great comment, Andy, and Andre does excellent work in this regard. So a good resource to know. So in that evaluation process, let me talk about the standard of evidence, and that's an important consideration. So the forever gold standard is the the double-blind, placebo-controlled or comparator-controlled clinical trial with adequate numbers and excellent statistical preparatory work, so that the study actually does what it pretends to do. And then if there's a DTx god there, it gets published in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? So what is the evidentiary standard? So those are the types of things that we look at, and from there we kind of work backwards in our evaluation of the quality of the data. Does it meet the highest evidentiary standard? And then there are different ways to categorize the level of evidentiary standard that a particular drug, for example, or in this case a DTx, would meet. If it meets those characteristics, it's kind of undeniable. If the evidence is pretty clear that you do this and that happens and it's beneficial, and everybody can accept that, and it happens repeatedly, it takes time, usually not one clinical trial to do the work. But if there's reason to believe that the evidence is there and it supports the claims for the product, whatever it may be, then that's an important, that's a minimum standard, minimum threshold for adoption and payment. So then you've got your contextual issues. So for MassHealth, again, speaking for myself, but in that experience, not having had any experience with this particular type of product, an area that was of great concern to us as a payer and as an organization, part of our mission was that payers products address substance use disorder or opioid use disorder, which is a critically problematic condition in the Medicaid program. So that was probably one of the early signals. I had been following payers products for about 3+ years before we actually did the evaluation, based on our pipeline monitoring and my awareness of what was going on in the market. So here we have a product that is publishing in peer-reviewed journals evidence of benefit, and was the tip of the spear that created the prescription drug therapy category. it started to unfold as an opportunity for the Medicaid program to provide additional services to our members, the Medicaid program, and to establish a beachhead on how to evaluate these products, because everybody that's listening to my voice knows that this is just literally the bleeding edge, where this wave hasn't broken yet, so it's still building, and it's going to continue to get larger and larger. And from a payer perspective, we need the assistance, the layering out of which ones are we going to be able to turn our attention to. So for my team, in our framework for evaluation, digital therapeutics, we are largely focused on, right today, exclusively focused on MassHealth, on prescription digital therapeutics. There are others, but that's one that we are focusing on. I see Laurel raises her hand.
Well, no, the only thing I wanted to say is that I didn't want people to miss something very important that you said. And so I just wanted to sort of call it out. And that is that one of the reasons, or the main criteria that you used for reset, was that it was solving a problem that you were deeply concerned about. And I think that that's something that when I work with a lot of companies, whether in the DTx space or others, that fundamental question is, what's the clinical problem you're trying to solve? And is it of a strategic importance to the payer who you want to pay for it? And I just wanted to just bring that up because you run into that a lot, where really understanding what that clinical problem is and what understanding does it fit within the strategic priorities of the payer is going to be a really key component of that, and understanding that from the beginning, because it's always like, how big is the problem and is it big enough for someone to want to pay for it? So I just wanted to just bring that out, what you said, because I thought that was important.
I think that's
Yeah.
a critical point, Laurel, just to punctuate, for the Medicaid program, because it was novel, and we're Medicaids tend to be quite conservative. I had to essentially, my colleagues and I that were steeped in the management of opioid use disorder, had to be internal champions of the idea. We had to. This happened because we wanted it to internally. Of course, we have plenty of support from our friends and colleagues at Payer. Their motivation was similar to ours, but ours wasn't about turning the profit. It was about breaking this ice and finding a therapy that would be pertinent to our population. And I think that if we got into the 7 or 8 different PDTs that are approved today, each of the conversations is going to be slightly different. So Achilles' product with ADHD, we have many members in the Medicaid program that have ADHD. But the conversation about ADHD is necessarily and significantly different than it is for Reset and Reset-O, for opioid use disorder. We could be talking, different games, frankly, so it's really important that you have that there is the product resonates with the payer or the population they serve. Is a no-brainer, fall off a turnip truck, or has just such compelling evidence that you're going to say, got to do this. This is just medically necessary. To the point you were making, Laurel, is that,
Right.
Yeah, we pay for, in the Medicaid program, we define medical necessity by law, in our regulations in Massachusetts. It would be slightly different in Massachusetts than it would be in other states because we're a Medicaid state. And then one more thing, and I'll shut up, is that a lot of Medicaid programs work off of the Medicare approval. So some Medicaid programs will not pay for a service unless it's covered by CMS. And then we use the same coding, and we actually may use the same payment structure as CMS for that product. That's commonplace in Medicaid programs. And then that can extend to the Medicaid managed care. So Medicaid is not just a little slice of the market. There's 77 or 80 million lives in Medicaid. I'm sorry, did I say Medicare? In Medicaid in the United States, either fee-for-service or managed Medicaid. So it's a substantial portion of the market.
Let me ask you some questions about thresholds. Paul, you mentioned the quality of the evidence, and for Laurel and Andy, a lot of the companies will conduct a randomized controlled study to get the authorization. But then when it comes to the real world evidence, that may not necessarily be an RCT. So, Laurel and Andy, what are you advising your clients to do in terms of the quality of the study used to capture the real world evidence? Does it have to be RCT?
I think it depends, and not always. It doesn't. I think that's always, everybody defaults to that, sort of it's the gold standard, but it doesn't always make sense in some populations to do an RCT, and it may not even be necessary. But what is important is the methodology that you use to collect the data, to make sure that you're inserting your own bias in it, for example. So when you're talking about real world evidence, I think it has advantages over an RCT because it's done in settings that are in the real world. So the question with RCTs is always, can I replicate this in the real world? Is it going to actually, yield the same results as it did? And so I think that payers, at least the payers that I work with, really want to see rigorous evidence in a variety of settings. Just to make a point, a pilot is not a study. And we have to be careful with that. How big does the study have to be? Sometimes it depends on how big of the problem is you're trying to solve and how widespread it is. Might increase the number of patients that you need in a study to really reflect the real world and how it will work. But I also think patient engagement for digital therapeutics is hugely important. Are patients actually going to use the product? Are they going to be compliant? A lot of payers I talk to want that question answered because they want to understand, I don't want to pay for something that someone's not going to use. So how are you ensuring compliance? And how are you making sure that people, for example, in certain populations, do they have access to the smartphone or the wearable or other ways to be able to actually collect the data, and will they use it? And then also looking at how is this going to impact my total cost of care for this particular disease state. So I think, I just back to what Paul was saying too about the strategic importance to the payer. I have worked with some companies where the payers go, it's not a problem for me, it's their problem, but I don't really see it as a strategic problem. But we sort of, because you are so enmeshed in that problem, we were able actually to go into the data and show and demonstrate that it actually is a problem. And so that creates a lot of cost for the company, but there are times when you have to do that to be able to demonstrate that. So, and then you can also use that as a health economics study to start to understand what costs you really need to address in a study. So.
Yeah, I guess just to add, what I tell people is make sure you plan ahead for it, because collecting real world evidence is after you're approved, and it takes more than 1 month to do it, right? So as you're thinking about a launch, make sure you understand, like, okay, let's get some real world evidence first before thinking I'm going to go national, because it's unfortunate, but it's really easy for a payer to say no to a digital therapeutic under the pretense of you don't have enough data. And there are durable medical equipment products, there are other types of products that don't necessarily have that same bar because they're understood how to put them in their system, right? And because it's still complex to integrate this into the healthcare infrastructure, it's oftentimes the easiest way to just say the data is not there. So we kind of have to prep for that and realize that I think health econ is incredibly important, right? Because it's really easy for an insurance company or a payer to say, well, this only cost me X. And all of a sudden you're trying to say, well, this product costs more, right? And no matter what, if you do your own health econ study, you're going to see cost up here compared to what a payer will find if they look at their own data. But if you can go in ahead of time and have all of that ready to go, including people utilize the product, maybe even do an innovative contract that says if people aren't engaged, then you don't have to pay us as much, that type of thing I know is out there. Then you can start setting yourself up for more success, because the plumbing is still not quite there with coding and the understanding of how to use software as a medical device in the real world.
So this might be a difficult question to answer, but obviously the healthcare economics matter. It would stand to reason that the longer the durability of effect of using the therapy, the more the savings might be, the higher the patient engagement, the higher the effect. Yet at the same time, most of the prescriptions are written for 90 days. And so a question for any of you, is there a minimum duration of benefit, whether that's 6, 9, 12 months or longer, that's critical to demonstrate?
I could take a crack at that. That becomes a challenging question to answer in the context of how did the product come to market. So if the pair products got their FDA clearance through a 90-day study, that's the evidence that we have to work with. Then, and not to diminish the importance of real-world evidence, that's a kind of seals the deal, if you will. If the randomized controlled trial shows that it's beneficial and then real world evidence supports that, then we're off on our merry way. But ideally, who wouldn't like a one and done? Here, use this for a month and you're cured. Well, then you have to go back from there. We do have drugs like that in the market now, right? That are very complex and very expensive. So the duration of benefit needs to be tied to the value of the product. Let me go with that, because there's no great answer. In other words, if it's a 90-day prescription and it costs $100, does it deliver $100 of benefit over that 90 days? Or bonus, does it deliver $200 of benefit after you stop using it because it's got a durable effect? Or are we willing to pay for, a renewal of the prescription? We came to that conclusion with the reset products, as Pear brought more information to the market and published more data on reuses of the product, there was a benefit there. So, that goes into the decision-making process. So I don't leave it, and maybe it'll come up later, the guarantee that, patient engagement, of course, is critical. I can think of, for those of you old enough to remember C. Everett Koop, who famously said, no medication works if you don't take it, right? So the same thing happens here, right? So we need adherence, but the payer may not be willing to pay for adherence. We may look at it as, well, that's on you and the patient. They have to be engaged in here. And so what I'm going to really look at is the outcomes. 100 patients, I expect 50% of them to get better. I don't care if they don't get better because they stopped using it or because it didn't work for them. But what I'm paying for is this outcome, this performance metric, so so that's a common thing now. It's with drug therapy as well, with these types of products is, well, we'll guarantee a certain adherence rate, of 70% or whatever the number turns out to be. It's like, maybe I don't care about that. Maybe you need to pay attention to that, you and how you educate your providers and how they manage their patients. What I'm paying for is, did the thing that this was trying to stop happening? Let me measure that.
Yeah, and I think also it depends on what your digital therapeutic is being used to treat. Because, for example, in the case of reset, where you're really trying to get to some endpoints around addiction and not using, the drugs anymore, or versus a digital therapeutic that's targeting chronic disease like RA or lupus or something like that, where you have to ensure that your digital therapeutic is meeting other endpoints, because the patient's not going to get better because of your digital therapeutic. But in the case of like a COPD patient, they may reduce the number of hospitalizations that they have. The number of ED visits, maybe it's like they're hospitalized, they go home with it, they don't come back, so it's a readmissions issue. So I think understanding sort of the pertinent outcomes related to the disease that you're treating and what's really realistic to expect from yours is important. Although most payers I've worked with like some sort of durability between 6 and 12 months, only because I want to make sure that I'm not paying for something and then I'm going to have to start paying for the other stuff again anyway, and
Mhm.
it's causing me double hit on my budget. So, so anyway, that's.
Yeah, great points, Laurel. All great.
So let me ask a final question. We've reached kind of the end of our time here. It's gone by so fast. I know we could spend another 2 hours on this. And just going back to what you said earlier, Andy, we've just kind of established the baseline of some important coding being put into place. We have entities like MassHealth providing some important coverage decisions. So final question, how many years from now, whether it's 1, 3, 5 or more, will it take until reimbursement is no longer the key constraint on PDT revenue growth? Andy, let me start with you.
Oh man, I want to put on my DTA hat and say it'll be like 3 months from now, you know? Realistically, that's a really hard question to answer. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of movement in the right direction. We were just the Digital Therapeutics Alliance just took 10 of our members down to Capitol Hill last week and met with Senate Finance Committee and a fair number of staffers at different for the bipartisan bill. And everybody knows what digital therapeutic is now. I mean, maybe they don't know like exactly what it is, like per the DTA's definition, but they understand the value. But that doesn't mean that the government is going to, in 6 months, say we're passing this bill when they have these other massive issues going on. And so like something like what's in the bill, if that were to get into other policy without having to pass legislation, that would start to trigger that next step that reimbursement isn't going to be an issue. But when that's going to happen that's really hard to say.
Laurel, what would you opine on this?
Well, having spent a career in reimbursement and health policy legislation, I will say that it's never going to be solved. And I hate to say that. I think it's incremental, and I think certain circumstances propel things forward. So for example, in the issues around behavioral health and chronic disease management and the use of telehealth and all of that, the COVID-19 pandemic just really propelled a lot of that forward just because it was necessary. And so, but I still think, having worked on the telehealth benefit for as many years as I have, that's still being worked out. And so I don't think it's ever fixed, but I do think we start to see incremental improvements and options for digital therapeutics that I think are accelerating at a faster pace than they were in the past. Certainly legislation or a defined benefit category is necessary. That takes a long time. It does take a long time. But in the meantime, we're looking at even things like a practice expense CPT codes, only codes that might pick up and allow the physician to, prescribe and engage with the patient. Because to me, that's a key element of digital therapeutics too, is the ability for the physician to actually see data and be able to design care pathways based on that data. So I just it's kind of a long answer to say, I know investors want to hear in 2 years everything's going to be solved, but it's not. But I do think we are definitely getting momentum and we're making progress in a way that I haven't seen before. So,
Paul, final word.
So I'm in the Laurel camp. I don't think it will ever change. I've been in healthcare for a long, long time, and there are still strings left untied from 1964. I mean, back to Andy's point, the Medicaid, Medicare benefits were created without a prescription drug benefit mandatory. Even Medicaid, it's an optional benefit that every state provides. So I think it will be a while. I don't think a couple of points. It used to be it took 17 years to establish a medical gold standard, from the time it was first introduced. But I don't think it'll take us 17 years. Information and the time to produce it is compressed because we're all technologically different than we were 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30. So the amount of time is compressed. So I do think it will be incremental. And I think that there will be sufficient advances made both by the industry and by that is the developer industry, as well as the payer and provider industry, as things like, health information exchange gets better, the use of technology gets better and a little more facile, so that somebody doesn't have to really go outside of their workflow in order to do this particular thing. I think that's key, is having it fit into the workflow. And I think that that's incrementally changing. So I'm optimistic that we'll see a smattering of adoptions over the next several years, and then it'll pick up. Then there'll be a pretty steady pace. Once the threshold is broken, there are codes, payers are paying for it. It becomes part of the common lexicon. Patients start talking about it. Then you're good. Then things are going to start hopping. But it won't be 17 years, and it won't be one.
Well, great. Laurel, Andy, Paul, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Sure.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay.